Nowadays, certain economic truths have become accepted as self-evident. A second Bill of Rights, under which a new basis of security and prosperity can be established for all.
FDR introduced his second Bill of Rights in 1944.
The Universal Declaration of Human Rights was passed in Paris in
And then 4 years later, the UN adopted what they called the Universal Declaration of Human Rights.
Yeah.
What, in your opinion, did this do to modern society?
Delegitimize the whole notion, concept of the nation state.
Who here believes they are indeed a citizen of the world?
I want us to be a truly global Britain, a country that reaches beyond the borders of Europe.
Having a devotion to your national allegiance essentially means stigmatizing and demonizing others.
We think that schools should focus more on teaching to be a global citizen rather than to be nationalism. We should just all be considered humans as opposed to be considered a citizen of a country.
The world is growing. We have failed to redistribute that growth in a way that actually enhances the lives of many people around the world. If I think specifically of some of the examples of this, there are many policies today that have short-term gains.
In the days of the monarchy, kings and their nobles could do just about anything they wanted. There was no middle class to hold them accountable. Sure, there was always a threat of insurrection, which to some extent tamed the impulses of power. But for the most part, the king typically was the final arbiter on all matters, and his nobles were typically the ones who advised him. There's always been a literary and philosophical drive to push for a different kind of government, but in the 18th century, you had the Enlightenment, the popularization of a thing called the social contract. The Western world began to rethink governance, the notion of nation states and self-government. A new social climate was born. In this new social climate, the nobility didn't exactly go away. Their ilk still had the agenda to secure power for themselves. They're no longer known as the nobility. They're now known as the bureaucracy. They simply changed the tactics they used to achieve their agendas. The way to secure power in a world where everybody's opinion for the direction of the country is supposed to matter is to convince those people that the direction you wish to take them is for their own good.
I think the American people believe.
The American people believe.
The American people believe.
The American people believe.
Political demagogues figured out that they can secure power for themselves by way of collectivism.
President Truman asks Eleanor Roosevelt to accept an appointment as the United States delegate to the United Nations.
So they resolved to push the idea of collectivism by way of the deceptive rhetoric of human rights.
This Universal Declaration of Human Rights.
That is the real motive behind the creation of the United Nations.
The flagrant violation of human rights by Nazi and fascist countries sowed the seeds of the last World War, has supplied the impetus for the work which brings us to the moment of achievement here today.
The whole premise behind the creation of the UN was to try to prevent another war on such a scale.
The world we want to live in is a world in which everyone lives in freedom. But freedom is not possible until people know how to use that freedom for the good of all.
It sets in motion this disconnect between the governing structure and the citizenry itself.
How long you been in this country?
Not dominant this morning.
Oh. You don't like it here?
Go back. The first day.
Then go back.
Go back. But I go back. Will you go back from Vietnam? I go back.
I was in Vietnam.
Who's right and who's wrong now?
Who's right?
The Viet Cong right, the Russians right, or we? Who's right and who's wrong?
The United States is wrong.
Oh, and the others are right?
Because of one thing.
It's only for right after Congress that you're standing here alive.
I am of the belief that, of course, societies are built from below. A lot of politicians began to embrace this idea that it's not about what small pockets of society want out of their representatives? What do they want as far as policy is concerned in their immediate communities, right? Things that actually matter to them, things that are important to them. It became about something more, something bigger, something broader.
The time has arrived in America for the Democratic Party to get out of the shadows of states' rights and to walk forthrightly into the bright sunshine of human rights.
Hubert Humphrey said to the American people that human rights was sort of like the new thing and that we need to get over our obsession with states' rights, right? It's time to put states' rights to bed. It's time to embrace human rights, whatever that is.
The right of every family to a decent home, the right to adequate medical care, and the opportunity to achieve and enjoy good health, the right to adequate protection from the economic fears of old age.
Human rights can be better understood as the rights of the so-called collective, which ironically you can't have without infringing upon the rights of the individual. The individual becomes a slave to the collective by will or by force, insofar that the so-called collective has a right to the individual's labor. You can say that you have a right to adequate housing, but it takes individuals to build those houses. You can say that you have a right to health care, but it takes individuals to administer medical care.
It really begs the question, well, what exactly are you entitled to as a human being? Theodore Roosevelt gave a speech in 1910 called the New Nationalism.
Labor is prior to and independent of capital. Capital is only the fruit of labor.
He talked about a lot of the things that his cousin would go on to do. He says something to the effect of, I know that people are going to hear me say what I'm saying and they're going to accuse me of being a communist.
If that remark was original with me, I should be even more strongly denounced as a communist agitator than I shall be anyhow.
He acknowledges, like, I know how I sound, but let's not be afraid to do what we know is necessary because our opponents are going to say that, well, we're communists.
The prime problem of our nation is to get the right type of good citizenship. And to get it, we must have progress, and our public men must be genuinely progressive.
The theoreticians who came up with these ideas, it kind of gave the impetus for the National Socialist movement. Many of them, if not all of them, were in fact doctrinaire Marxists and followers of Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel. And so it's the same ideology kind of driving this movement of a planned society.
The issue of Social Security. So let's start with what Cardi B had said about Social Security. She had mentioned that FDR, one of her favorite former presidents, was the real Make America Great Again president because if it weren't for him, older Americans wouldn't get Social Security.
You've mentioned that FDR is one of the great leaders in American history. Why is that?
When FDR introduced Social Security, you know what happened? They called it socialism. But senior citizens decided that, you know what, if I've got some protection in my golden years, that's something that's worth fighting for.
There was much greatness about FDR, Newt. I think you would agree. There was much greatness about FDR.
Absolutely.
And you can be a conservative today or whatever and still understand that he was a great man.
Historians have a way of mythologizing their heroes of old. They mythologize the likes of FDR and Teddy Roosevelt.
FDR was a great orator.
A great man.
A great politician.
The great guy.
A great president.
A great extricator.
Guess what? Reagan loved FDR.
Theodore Roosevelt, as you suggested, is the first modern president.
As a believer in God, I do believe in his providential will. I do believe that nothing happens without God's permission for it to happen. I get you. But for those who would say that Teddy Roosevelt, sure, he may have been Marxist in some of the things that he did. FDR may have been Marxist in many of the things that he did. However, they were able to, in a sense, modernize society and to elevate creature comforts to a degree that the world did not know before. What would you say to those folks?
FDR would say the exact same things. The fact of the matter is that from 1929 up to 1933, when FDR was sworn in, the economy was actually improving.
So we get the stock market crash in '29. Fundamentally, the policies in place are those of Calvin Coolidge and every president before, small federal government. And we see signs that the market begins to correct itself.
Right.
The economy begins to recover. And then Herbert Hoover and Congress decide what to do to fix things.
Yes.
And they immediately make things worse. And Franklin Roosevelt comes in and keeps fixing it and keeps fixing it and keeps fixing it. And it stays bad, bad, bad.
Yes.
That's a fair assessment?
Yes.
Okay.
Bill after bill pours into Congress from the White House. Whatever Roosevelt wants, he gets. The House is burning down, says the Republican floor leader. So give the president anything he needs to put out the fire. Through 100 historic days of a special session, every New Deal measure passes without question.
We've never seen such a wholesale takeover of society, of our economy, just the whole 9 yards. Never before had the United States seen anything like that.
The country demands bold, persistent experimentation, the president says, and the country gets it. Secretary of Agriculture Henry Wallace launches the AAA. The new Secretary of the Interior, Harold Ickes, administers the PWA. The Secretary of Labor, Francis Perkins, an advocate of economic planning. And an alphabetical avalanche of new offices and agencies. FDRA, CCC, TVA. But the most urgent measure in 1933 is NRA, a system of codes administered by General Hugh Johnson to regulate wages, hours, and employment.
He used the NRA and his Public Works Administration to employ the constituents in these various areas at their own expense. So essentially, he began to bribe the taxpayers with their own money.
Men are going to work for the government by the millions on new buildings, roads, schools, bridges, anything to get the forgotten man, as Roosevelt calls him, off the bread lines and on the job.
FDR would say we have to invest in our less fortunate by increasing the national debt.
We're $35 trillion in debt. We don't have union money.
In the case of Social Security, we're all just sitting back.
We are in huge trouble.
Watching the clock tick down.
Payments to beneficiaries will exceed the money paid into the program next year.
Waiting to see if in the next 10, 15 years, we'll even have Social Security after having paid into it.
This is certainly not part of Larry Gessick's retirement plan.
There are all sorts of predictive markers out there that suggest that within the next 10, 15 years, Social Security will be insolvent, bankrupt.
The Gessicks came out of retirement not because they wanted to, but because they had to.
That's what happens. When you make these kinds of promises, you inevitably end up with more takers than you have producers.
Nobody instructed any of us to put money aside and make your own way later on down the road.
Someone has to foot the bill. No, the progressive era is not responsible for our creature comforts. Social safety net programs in the long run have proven to be detrimental, not just to America's financial well-being, but to individualism, merit, the ideas that made us what we are. The government is not responsible for our quality of life. We owe the comforts we enjoy to God and to the private sector.
We have tried spending money. We are spending more than we have ever spent before, and it does not work.
In 1939, Treasury Secretary and one of his closest advisors, Henry Morgenthau, informed the Ways and Means Committee that we've made a huge mistake.
We have never made good on our promises. I say after 8 years of this administration, we have just as much unemployment as when we started, and an enormous debt to boot.
A lot of people actually said, well, if you're telling me that FDR's administration was a disaster, how in the world was he elected for 4 times?
4 times in a row, yeah.
Edward L. Bernays, you're the father of public relations. What led you more than 60 years ago to see the need for public relations?
I was a member of the United States Committee on Public Information.
At the same time that we see FDR making his ascent and public life as it relates to politics and people's perception of politics, you at the same time see the materializing of the work of such figures as Edward Bernays and Walter Lippmann and others.
I found that ideas were weapons and were even more effective than bullets.
You see Edward Bernays talking about the manufacturing of consent. Manufacturing of consent.
Yeah. We worked out the engineering of consent in a democratic society like our own. The consent of the public is basic to anyone's meeting his or her social goals. I called what we did publicity direction. I would direct the conduct of people so that they could win through ideas their public goals.
Walter Lippmann referred to the public as the bewildered herd. He believed in the expert class, and he believed in the so-called intelligentsia, guiding and directing the bewildered herd.
Now every train to Washington brings its cargo of experts to join the great assault on the Depression. Economists, sociologists, statisticians, agronomists, idealists, world savers, each with a pet panacea, a surefire system to save the country. Along with master politicians like James Farley and Louis Howe, the president surrounds himself with bright young college professors, such as Raymond Moley, Rexford Guy Tugwell, and Adolph Burley, men who generate new ideas and new policies. They are the brain trust of the Roosevelt Revolution.
An intelligence bureau can be an instrument of action, of the representative charged with decision. The purpose is not to burden every citizen with expert opinions on all questions, but to push that burden away from him toward responsible administrators.
Whether it's the work of Walter Lippmann in his book Public Opinion, or the work of Bernays in his book Propaganda, I think it's important to note here in mentioning these names that I'm not trying to introduce yet another boogeyman for people to be afraid, be very afraid of. There was a concerted effort by way more than just them to drastically change the way that politics are done in America by expanding the federal government and the proliferation of the administrative state. For every Edward Bernays and Walter Lippmann, you had plenty of political strategists who are doing the same kind of work. FDR just so happened to have benefited from this climate, which convinced a fear-stricken, propagandized people to assist in the building of the administrative state.
Let us unite in banishing fear.
Posturing himself as an executive who's surrounded by experts, FDR did exactly what Lippmann was generally advocating for in order to win the public's trust.
All the experts, foreign and domestic policy, would give us advice, then we'd sit alone in a room.
Listen to people who are experts in these areas.
Experts on small businesses. We will listen to the scientists and public health experts.
It seems that even today, we still haven't learned our lesson. We still haven't realized that this is our country because we continue to abdicate to the so-called expert class.
Governor, you say trust the experts. But those same experts for 40 years said that if we shipped our manufacturing base off to China, we'd get cheaper goods. They lied about that. They said if we shipped our industrial base off to other countries, to Mexico and elsewhere, it would make the middle class stronger. They were wrong about that. They were wrong about the idea that if we made America less self-reliant, less productive in our own nation, that it would somehow make us better off, and they were wrong about it. And for the first time...
And to think that more than half, depending on where you live, of your life, your labor, and your time, and your energies, and your sacrifices goes into the hands of someone who believes, for no legitimate reason whatsoever, that they are morally and intellectually superior to you.
We are going to continue to rely on the advice of medical experts in the federal government on what kind of masks we all should wear. What kind of
They cannot abide your freedom because your actions seek to offset their plans.
Many of us are frustrated with the nearly 80 million Americans who are still not vaccinated. This is not about freedom or personal choice. It's about protecting yourself and those around you. I'm announcing that the Department of Labor is developing an emergency rule to require all employers with 100 or more employees to ensure their workforces are fully vaccinated. We've been patient, but our patience is wearing thin, and your refusal has cost all of us.
If the trick in a constitutional republic is to get the public to go along with what it is you wish to do, what it is you wish to build, you have to give it some level of legitimacy. And you do so by the formulation of various organizations that you know by their acronyms.
Visit the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention.
The United States will remain a member of the World Health Organization.
I send my deep thanks and warm congratulations to President Biden and Vice President Harris.
You do it through the false authority of bureaucratic departments.
The Department of Labor approved.
The Department of Transportation requires. The Department of Education recommended.
The Department of Commerce plans.
Because these institutions are now so solidified, if it has a stamp of approval from this organization, it's a done deal. Like, because they know best. Look, they were established in 1909, they were established in 1911, 10, 13, 14, so on and so forth. So you have a lot going on in the early part of the 20th century, all with this desire to organize society.
You know, we have all these alphabet agencies. Many of them have been with us for a very, very long time. Mm-hmm. At the same time, there's this disdain for the folks that actually built America.
Right. If you got a business, that you didn't build that.
I will enact the first ever federal ban on price gouging.
It seems to me to be plain that no business which depends on paying less than living wages to its workers has any right to continue in this country.
FDR literally put businessmen in prison. He took a small group of folks involved in certain industries and they came up with a plan.
With every passing month, we are making strides in the orderly handling of the relationship between employees and employers.
Set a certain price, allow our workers to work this amount of time, and we're going to pay them this much.
There was a code now, a code of fair practices.
So you had individuals in certain industries that were setting parameters for entire industries. You had your local mom and pop shops. They were able to charge lower prices because their costs were relatively low. If on a federal level, the major tire distributors are setting prices for the entire country, now that small business person can't afford to raise their prices, because if you can get a comparable substitute at a lower price, a lot of people will do that. Mm-hmm. If you're telling me that Chad O. Jackson Plumbing is gonna charge me the same thing that Roto-Rooters is charging, they're gonna go with the person they see on television. Right. They're gonna bypass the small guy and go with the bigger guy because his stuff costs the exact same amount. That's what they were doing. And you had some folks who were like, no, we're not doing that.
A big competitor had made complaint against me. Unable to obtain bail, I was placed in New York County Jail.
FDR went after him, put a lot of people out of business.
An unconstitutional law of my country.
So, as I travel the country, what I hear time and again from those who own small businesses and those who aspire to start them is that too often an entrepreneur has a great idea, not too often, that's good, but they don't have access to the capital that they need to make it real.
If you and I have a business, right, and you put in the work, you dipped into your savings, you bought the necessary materials that you need to start your business, and you went public with it. And I didn't put in the same amount of work that you did, but I think I should have a business like Chuck has a business.
Right.
And so I go to the government, hey, I want to have a business like Chuck has a business. So the government fronts me money that I don't have to pay back. And now I have a business and I'm competing with you. This is from each according to their ability to each according to their need kind of philosophy that we see at work.
The right of every businessman, large and small, to trade in an atmosphere of freedom, freedom from unfair competition and domination, by monopolies at home or abroad.
He said that the small businessman can't compete in the workforce and in the marketplace because of monopolizers, because of these elitist, capitalist, industrialist types, and it squeezes the little guy out. The little guy has a right to compete, says FDR.
You understand what I'm talking about in terms of when we build up our small businesses, what that does to entire communities to lift them up economically, civically, culturally.
This delegitimize the free market system because he thinks that the government should have the right to pick winners and losers.
We will take on corporate landlords who are hiking rental prices. And we will work with builders and developers to construct 3 million new homes and rentals.
If the government seizes control in this incremental way of the producing of housing, what would this belief from the public that the government should be involved in housing look like in 50 years from now or 100 years from now, where basically the government owns the house and you're leasing from the government, but it's not yours. I mean, it's kind of like the slow march to Karl Marx's dream of the government owning everything.
The right of every family to a decent home.
This right to housing, it goes back to the 19th century, as a matter of fact. The Great Famine in Ireland in the mid-1800s, you saw a lot of Irish immigrants from Italy, and a lot of Poles and Jews and people coming from Germany. There was a man by the name of Jacob Riis. He's like the one who set the wheel in motion for this whole social reform movement centered around housing. He spent some time kind of toiling, trying to find his way, and he eventually got a job as a reporter. He became transfixed on urban issues and urban problems because he had in his mind this idea that when he was going to come into the United States, it was just going to be, right, the city's just paved with gold and just, oh man, but that's not what he saw. In his mind, it wasn't that they made the decision to come here. They don't even know what the heck they're doing. They're just trying to find a way, right? I mean, just sort of let the process kind of play itself out. In the mind of Jacob Riis, the key issue was the environment itself and the places in which these people lived. And the best of them was not allowed to shine, was not allowed to come through because they didn't have adequate housing. You change the environment, you change where these people live, you change their circumstances, they will then go on to act better. And so Jacob Riis had this bright idea. He said, well, how about I start taking pictures of the things that I'm seeing? He would go and he would traverse through New York's seedy underbelly and he would take pictures. He began to give lectures on the images that these photographers would capture. He ends up getting a book deal and he releases this book in 1890 called How the Other Half Lives. This is really what set off the affordable, adequate housing movement.
Jacob Riis's photos as an instrument to steer emotions in the American public was discovered to be a huge success. Over the course of the 20th century, photography, video newsreels, and propaganda were a catalyst that social engineers would use time and again in many different ways to move the public in the direction they wish them to go.
We must use pictures, we must use flow, we must use emotion.
We have to dramatize the moment and
within a couple of years, it changed the country and the world dramatically. And it happened just by consciousness raising.
Convincing the electorate through various psychological methods that an easy government fix will take care of all of our problems. They are gradually de-incentivizing the conventional way, accountability, hard work, family formation, things that not only causes a society to thrive, but to do so with strength and longevity. The more we learn to trust the administrative state, the weaker we become as a society, and the riper we become for totalitarian control. This is why we must, with God's help, master our emotions rather than allowing them to be exploited by social demagogues. What do you think it is about human beings that makes this kind of demagoguery work? I mean, when you consider the 4-time elected FDR, when you consider how the civil rights movement and the amount of youth that it was able to amass and to show up not only on that day in 1963, but also for the protests around Vietnam and so on. And not just the civil rights movement, but all of the other social justice movements over the course of the late 60s going into the 70s. When you see how there was this mass compliance to government shutdowns around COVID, what is it about us that makes us so willing and ready to comply to this kind of demagoguery? Is it that we just want to be taken care of? Was Lippmann and a lot of the sentiments that he had, was he right about a lot of the things that he was saying?
You know, to answer your question though, just one word sprung to mind, man. One word. It's redemption. It's all we want. It's all human beings want. We just want redemption. And you know, I know you always talk about, you know, coming to Christ and Jesus, and that's just it, man. I think a lot of people, they know that they fall short of something, right? Whether they acknowledge it or not. That's why people cling to causes, right? This inherent need or will to, or want to sacrifice for the greater good, right? To acknowledge that there's something out there that's bigger than themselves, right? I'm doing the community, I'm doing the world a favor, I'm doing a good thing, I'm saving the climate, or I'm helping a disenfranchised person here or there, whatever the case, right? Because they know that they need to be redeemed. And I just think they just put the emphasis, or put that want, they just put it in the wrong place. Because you're not going to get, of course it's just not going to get you what you want. Right? There's only something supernatural, something beyond this world can do that.
So they see the policy, the politician, the activist as a salvific figure.
Yeah, because we all want salvation. Even an atheist knows that he has to be saved, whether he acknowledges it or not. You know what I mean? That's why he or she, that's why they do what they do. That's why they say the things that they say. Somebody save me, redeem me, you know. That's what they want. And it's a shame that they don't see it.